Well, welcome to this qualitative research refresher led by Dr. Alexander Jun. Dr. Jun is a professor in APU's Department of Higher Education. He's a seasoned researcher and scholar. He's published extensively on access to post-secondary education opportunities for historically underrepresented students. Titles of his books are revealing, and they include Higher Education Belief Systems in the Asia-Pacific region, Knowledge, Spirituality, Religion, and Structures of Faith, a book that he co-edited with department colleague Christopher Collins. Another recent title is White Evolution, The Constant Struggle for Racial Consciousness, which he co-authored with Christopher Collins. Dr. Jun has a BA in Political Science and Psychology from USC, MS in Education Counseling from Cal State University, Los Angeles, and a PhD in Education and Administration Policy from USC. He is APU's paid qualitative consultant, and he is available to assist faculty researchers one-on-one with qualitative methodology during the traditional academic year from September through May. As you were made aware of, today's qualitative research refresher presentation is being recorded, and links to the recording will be available in future announcements put out by the Provost's office through the Provost newsletter. So I'm pleased now to turn the rest of this time over to 11:30 to Dr. Alexander Jun.
Thank you so much, Don. What a joy to have worked with you for these many years, and I'm very thankful for everything that ORG has been doing. Colleagues and friends, good to see you all. Thanks for joining today. I am assuming that you have a research project that you have in mind that hopefully you will get done this summer, and we just need a refresher. This is always the door is closed, no one is listening. I'm not going to go into a teaching mode. I teach qualitative and advanced qualitative methods for our PhD students, but I'm not going to go into teaching mode. It's going to be a consulting mode. And so we'll cut to the chase and get to the right answers and be very specific. I won't throw it back at you like I do with our students and say, well, what do you think? I'm kidding. I'll still do some of that. But yeah, given all the cuts, I thought I would also mention some cuts. I'm going to cut to the chase and just say, these are the things you need to be thinking about for your project. And as Don mentioned, certainly available in the fall once the semester the year starts again for individual meetings, for consultation and things like that. What I thought I would do is start with just a broad overview, refresher of qualitative research in general. I'll try to move fairly quickly through that and then really give the bulk of the time to you all that you may have specific questions based on what I've said or just your own project, and then we could work it like a workshop that everyone will benefit from hearing other colleagues' questions and projects. It's probably going to be very similarly aligned as we engage together. So with that, if I may, I'm going to share my screen and do a little bit more formal talk here, and then we'll break up into, well, not break up, we'll have a discussion group, discussion as one large group. All right. So without any further ado, this is a refresher for qualitative research. I'm going to talk about the nature of inquiry, different methodologies, the importance of a research question, different approaches, and then nitty-gritty stuff. Site selection, how do I think about this? Participant selection, what does that look like? And interviews and observations, along with another slide I threw in there about beyond all of these types of things. What other things do we need to consider in addition to role of the researcher? All right. What types of data collection are we talking about? Remember, in terms of inquiry, two fundamentally different divergent approaches. Large sample sizes, some of us value that and find comfort in it. Others of us appreciate smaller informative sizes. Quantitative versus qualitative, right? You have a standardized instrument that needs to be repeatable and reliable. Or can we look at observations, participation as an interviewer, and engaging in conversation? Two fundamentally different methodological traditions, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is sort of a deductive analysis versus qualitative, which is inductive. But more specifically, we're talking about words, not numbers. Words, not numbers. I think of my work spouse who was mentioned several times, Chris Collins. He gave the example, which is more important, which is more significant, 1,000 or 1? Your partner tells you that she loves you 1,000 times, but tells you I'm leaving you once. Now, which is more significant, the 1,000 or the 1? Right? That reveals much about Chris Collins, I'll just say, since he's not here. But a great example of it's not just words, it's not just numbers, right? We have to give meaning to the words, and one story is an important story. In qualitative research, there are no outliers. Something to keep in mind. Do we find comfort in statistics and aggregated data, or are the narratives, the life story, and individual quotes really telling and something that is revealing about a population or a topic that you're trying to study? Even our writing styles change. Is it a formal scientific style of writing, or can you use a personal narrative approach and embrace more of a literary style? Even using first person singular, saying I. You are the instrument in qualitative research. So embedding yourself in the research is obvious. So can you then write it up in first person I as the researcher? You are the instrument, not a tool. Be an instrument, not a tool, as a researcher. Very, very important. And that's why I think literary style is also something that we should consider. Okay. Moving on, different types of methodology. This is important because we can no longer simply say I'm doing a qualitative study and then we have we're mixing our apples and oranges and just say, oh, it's all fruit. There are very specific traditions within qualitative research. We are no longer making the distinctions, oh, it's not quantitative, therefore it's this other, it's all qualitative. And I think it's important for us colleagues to know these traditions and try to keep to the fidelity of the different methodological approaches. These are some common ones that you've probably heard: ethnography, phenomenology, case study grounded theory, participatory action research. And you can see very, very brief definitions here. I think it's important for us to recognize what methodological tradition we're borrowing from, at the same time holding loosely and saying my approach is not an ethnography, because traditionally ethnographies take several years, right? Embedding yourself, learning a language and a culture, but we use ethnographic approaches, right? We'll employ ethnographic methods, but understanding what those traditions are. Phenomenology, most of us will use hermeneutic phenomenology. That's the most common. Again, I'm cutting to the chase. But even within phenomenology, there are many, many different traditions. But most social science researchers will land on hermeneutic phenomenology, primarily because that's the one that really identifies meaning making of participants who have a shared experience. A shared experience. That makes it hermeneutic phenomenology. And understanding that tradition, how phenomenology differs from ethnography and case study, et cetera. Case studies pretty common. We're familiar with it. Some people misunderstand case studies when we say, oh, can I focus on just an institution, or can I even focus on individuals? I thought if I focus on an individual, that's a narrative analysis or a life story. How can it be a case study? Again, within case study, many different traditions and offshoots. It's important for us to know our traditions and where we want to focus. Grounded theory is a term that gets thrown around a lot. There are grounded theory purists, people who hold to a Glasserian approach or classical grounded theory approach, and it should not be messed with. I go back to the idea that grounded theory evolves, and I say we're borrowing from grounded theory traditions, or we are employing grounded theory practices, but it's important for you, colleagues, to recognize what that tradition is before we start borrowing it. And all the terms and labels and traditions sort of get mixed in together, but it's important for us to know the history. Increasingly common in educational practices is participatory action research. Fundamental difference is most from all the others is most researchers will drop in and say, I'm going to conduct a study with the participants, with the natives, whatever. Participatory action research really is rooted in the community partnership aspect of it, and recognizing that practitioners in the field are the experts. They are the researchers trying to improve on their own practices. One of the areas that we haven't moved far enough with participatory action research, it might be community engaged, but it's still rarely community initiated, right? So unless you have a study where a community is coming to you, a church is coming to you saying, hey, you're a researcher, can you help us explore some of the things that we're trying to make better in some of our practices, right? That's community initiated. Oftentimes it's us going to the community and saying, hey, I'm a researcher, I'd love to help discover some of the problems that you have. And so it's engaged, but it's not initiated. There isn't a perfect formula for that, but these are things to consider. But participatory action research increasingly is a field, an area that many disciplines are exploring. All right, moving on now to research question. It's all about the question. Do you have an appropriate and rigorous design and methodology that flows logically and intentionally and purposefully from your research question? So sometimes when I do consulting with our colleagues at APU and some of my doctoral students, they'll ask a question, but it's actually rooted in a quantitative question. So your question is quantitative. Nothing wrong with that, but usually then I'm like, our conversation is going to be relatively short because what you want to know, the answer is found in a quantitative design, not in a qualitative design. And sometimes we switch it and we're like, well, I know I want to do qualitative, but I don't know what my question is. That's the cart before the horse. You want to make sure that your research question is clear enough that it impacts your design so that in your write-up, and if you're in a dissertation stage, even in your design section, you say, I've selected this particular design, think back to the previous slide, of all the different types of methodological approaches. I've chosen this design because it most aligns with my research question. So logic and reason, it's crazy enough to work. All right. This may mess with your head a little bit, but your research question drives your study. Your study also drives your research question. What I mean by that is your research question can evolve and change. And if you need to hang up now, you go right ahead and pursue a quantitative study. Remember my first slide, I talked about the different epistemologies. In quantitative, I know you have your research question and it cannot change. In qualitative, it actually should change because what emerges as you're conducting your study, you realize, oh, I thought I was going down this path, but what the data are giving me, what the field is giving me, I realize I'm asking the wrong question. At that point, it's a methodological existential reality crisis. Do I continue to double down on this path of inquiry, or can I change my question? Your study drives your question as much as your research question drives your study. The two need to be held in conflict in many ways, but holding loosely to both, because that's how you refine your study. I'm going to pause here and give you an opportunity to, as it marinates with you, if you have any questions about methodological design or a research question. And if not, you can save it up until the end and we'll do group discussion. All right, moving on then. I like to call this the lit review of methods. It's not a literature review, but it's important for us to recognize. For dissertations, I certainly require this for all PhD students, but for our colleagues, even for a paper, I think it's important for us to know the different schools of thought. Grounded theory, what was the original history, Glaser and Strauss, right, or the origin originators of this study. They were from the nursing school, UCSF. It's important to know these distinctions. How did then that original grounded theory method evolve and change, and which scholars led to some of these changes? So that's an important distinction, because are you a classical grounded theorist, or are you a more modern grounded theorist who takes different pieces of what grounded theory is today and uses it in a very practical, eclectic way? Or are you much more rigid, which is okay, but much more rigid in your approach to say, this is the traditional Glaser and Strauss model, and that's what I'm going to stick to. Knowing what the traditions are and the different schools of thought help you identify where you're going and keeping to the fidelity of your approach. Similar to quantitative, right? Qualitative has its traditions, and recognizing that. And that's part of our due diligence, I think. Here's a reality check. Very few studies are unexplored. There's nothing new under the sun. Was it King Solomon who said that, right? Nothing new under the sun. So there's nothing that's been completely unexplored in sciences, as far as I know. At the same time, I have a problem with some of our colleagues who say, oh, that study's been done before. Have you ever heard that? I'm thinking about exploring a study on Latinx first-generation students. Oh, that's been done before. The beauty of qualitative research is we embrace the reality of time and space. No study has ever been done before in that sense, right? My dissertation 20-something years ago was first-generation Latinx students going to college. My own study can be repeated because my participants have changed. Their thinking has changed. I have changed. I, as the instrument, has changed. And so one of the ideas I have right now is going back, doing sort of my 25th anniversary study, and going back and talking with my original participants and saying, I'd love to hear where you are. We were all like young at that point. Now, not so much. Okay. How will the literature impact the researcher's interpretive posture? Your epistemology is important because you are the instrument. Your biases, I'm going to talk about that in a second. Your biases are important in part of the study. There is no race neutral, gender neutral, orientation neutral study in social science. In any studies, the difference is for qualitative research, we recognize and embrace this. We recognize and embrace our biases as a researcher. In other words, we run toward the subjectivity. And I think that's an important element that we have to embrace. Sorry, there was a chat. Was there a question that came in? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Alex, I'm picking up a lot of gravelly. Is that how, Lynn, are you getting gravel? Oh, my apologies. Okay.
Well, it could just be me. Thanks. All right, down to the nitty gritty here, some more specifics. It's important to identify a site, but the site and the participants sometimes overlap, sometimes they don't. If your focus of your study is on individuals and people, then when you talk about a site, your rationale for picking a site may be more related to the individuals rather than the location, right? But if you're looking at a case study and you want to identify a site, then it's important for you to say the rationale for selecting a particular location, right? Nothing wrong with convenience sampling, right? So we're here in Southern California. There's nothing more, it doesn't make it more magical to say, I'm going to do a study on the East Coast because that feels more rigorous and scientific to go far away. It's okay to do a study in Southern California because we're in Southern California, right? But that's not what should drive us. It really needs to be understanding some of the context behind what sites we select. At the same time, there's a term that we use, backyard research. We want to be very careful with backyard research. If you're an APU employee, faculty member, and you want to do a study at APU, You just said it was okay, Alex. We don't have to go to New York. Yes, but then you've got this dynamic of power. If you're a faculty member, you really can't study students at your own institution, even if they're not your students, right? Your role as a faculty member, students may, or an administrator, students may not recognize the distinction, or junior faculty may not trust that you are going to be fair and impartial. We're not. We embrace our subjectivity. Okay. Identifying the site, providing rationale as to why you selected the site and why you didn't choose other places. I think that's an important, the limitations usually write themselves. Provide some details of a site. Sometimes it matters, right? The size of the institution. Is it private? Is it public? In terms of funding, it all depends on, again, it's germane to your research project, but these are things that you need to consider. What's the ethnic makeup? Gender, what's it like on the board? Not just the student population. This is also tied to historical context of the sites that you're considering. Again, we embrace subjectivity. There is no objectivity or neutrality. So things that may matter for your particular research question and the problem that you're addressing, this may matter. So consider the historical context of the site. And then the challenge is you've got this whole universe out there of places that you could examine. How did you go about narrowing down that process? Let me say a word about the reader and your writing. My rule number one for writing, remember the reader. Remember the reader. And assume the reader is an intelligent non-expert, right? Maybe not well-versed in your theological tradition or your particular academic field, but is an intelligent non-expert. Explain it to the reader as if the reader knows nothing, right? So if you pick 3 sites, the reader doesn't know why you picked 3 sites for your study unless you explain it to the reader. So remember the reader. Assume the reader knows nothing, but assume that the reader is an intelligent non-expert. Okay, that's site. Let's talk about participants. Who are you going to interview? Have you considered gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status? How did you go about finding your participants? Who's your primary interview, right? So if you want to focus on college-going youth, so you focus on the students, which is fine. That's your primary focus, but who else might be involved? Maybe teachers, counselors, administrators. Who else might be involved? Parents, classmates, other students, right? So you have concentric circles with your primary, secondary, and maybe even tertiary. And similar to the rationale for site selection, think about the process of whom you choose to interview and how. What's your rationale for participant selection? Some of us working on dissertations, this is, you write as much as you can and be exhaustive in your methods chapter of your dissertation. Obviously, it's economy of scale for a research paper or for a book, but I think it's important to include this because the reader needs to know, right? And then it's just a good practice of writing and wordsmithing. How do I take what would be a chapter in a dissertation on methods? How do I narrow that down to 2 paragraphs? And I think it's important for us to be able to practice that and get into that exercise, because when I read as a methodologist, even if it's for an article, and I was serving as a managing director for a journal, I go straight to the methods section and I read, do they explain how they found what they found? Do they explain how they went about the participant selection? Because if they don't, the prose and the storytelling is kind of meaningless to me because I need to know the rigor and the approach that the author took, right? So a little secret for me, and there are other reviewers like that. Yeah, I am reviewer number 2, by the way. I go straight to the methods and I said, I don't know what this person did. And because I don't know what the person did, I don't trust what the person said. And it makes for quick reading. Yes, there are people like me out there. And so this is why it matters that you explain in detail. Okay. interviews, and observations. Explain to the reader what types of data will you collect and how will you collect it. Individual interviews, very specific. How often, how many, and for how long, right? Typical interview is going to be 45 minutes to an hour. At minimum, you interview people twice. The first one is just for them to get to know you, right? Do they trust you? I'm working on some articles right now on interviewer-interviewee dynamics. And I had heard this in the counseling context. Maybe you've heard this. When you meet a counselor and you're a client, the first thing they want to know is, do I trust you? Will I be honest with you? And will I listen to what you have to say? I thought that was really helpful from a client therapist perspective. I'd apply this here too. When an interviewee, potential interviewee meets you, at first blush, do they trust you? Do you have a trustworthy persona, even on Zoom? And can you win them over? And are they going to be honest with you and share? I mean, we're really talking to strangers and learning from strangers. And within a very short amount of rapport, are we going to be able to engage with them and tell them? And less so the third point about, am I going to trust you and what you have to say? But it's those first two. Do I trust the interviewer? And am I going to say what I want to say? It takes more than one interview, usually. And then follow-ups and member checking and all those types of things. Those are important. So talking all the specifics of how often, how many, and how long is important for the reader to know the rigor of your study. Focus groups, if you're going to do them, how often, how many, how long? Common question I get, so I'll head it off at the pass here. Can an individual interviewee also be a participant in the focus groups? And there's debate on that. And I say yes, because how an individual responds in individual interview will be different from the dynamics that are provided from a focus group. The benefits of a focus group sometimes is I had the same experience or an idea, but I forgot to share it. Somebody else shares it in the group and you're like, oh yeah, that was my experience too. But your job as an interviewer is to make sure you bring that out. So someone makes a good point, you've got to pause and then ask the group, has anyone else had that experience? And give them a minute and somebody responds and you're like, oh good, somebody else did. Don't forget to ask it again. Anyone else have that experience? So it turns out there's more than just two people, right? And that's sort of the art and science of the interviewer, but we don't have time to get into that. You're welcome to crash one of the qualitative classes if you want to. Happy to have you join some of our PhD students. All right, observations are always happening, whether it's formal or informal. But when and where, with whom, how long, how often, that's an important element of this as well. Observations are also tied to your interviews. So to the extent possible, I like to always include a little bit of this. Observations of, tell us a little bit about the people. Give some humanity to the people that you're working with, right? So in your write-up, don't call them interviewer 1 or interviewee A or subject B, right? Give them pseudonyms, give some life to them, and maybe some characteristics about who they are, dynamics, some personality, something like that. Some information about who they are. And also in your write-ups, you're observing if a person's nervous and hesitant or they paused with a difficult response, that's also data, right? So that's where observations matter. It's not just a formal, I went into a school setting or I went to a church service and this is what I observed. Sometimes your observations are tied to interviews because, I'll give you an example of one of my studies. A student said, I tried really hard in class. I'm very actively engaged, but I'm just not doing well in this class. I went to class and I observed. I sat in the back. Student also sat in the back of this one lecture hall and fell asleep. And so I spent 45 minutes just watching my participant sleeping through class. And so for me, it was this being able to have disconfirming evidence, right? Triangulation is what we call it. The student said they were engaged. And yet in my observation, in one particular case, I noticed the student was not engaged, in fact, fell asleep in class. Part of the challenge with qualitative research as it continues to emerge is, am I interviewing or am I intervening? And where's the line between my objectivity and subjectivity? while I embrace subjectivity and I recognize the inconsistencies in this case of a student, and I'm using my observations as well as the interview information, my job isn't necessarily to go to the student and say, hey, listen, I saw you falling asleep in class. You're inconsistent. That's intervening. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but remember your role in what you're supposed to do. Okay. Aside from interviews, focus group and individual observations, this other very important piece, archival information, document analysis. Are there brochures, websites, information that you could get and obtain without asking the participants? This is due diligence on your part. How much pre-reading did you do going in, right? I find it interesting. It's always fun to note that when you go into an interview and you've done a lot of background information because you've read the websites, maybe the mission statement, whatever it is, then you're more well equipped to go in asking questions and you're less surprised by some of the answers that participants might offer, right? It's not that you're not as curious, but at least you've done the homework. Like you don't want the participant to talk about the mission statement and you being surprised, especially if it's available. You could go deeper because you're asking questions about the mission statement. Lynn, you had a question.
Yeah, question on what you just said about doing pre-reading or background work, because wouldn't that go back to methodology? Because if you're doing classical grounded theory, you walk in really from a not knowing stance. So just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're a classical grounded theorist, you're going to have a hard time with this one point that there is no new information, right? Where did that slide go? And so, we're not working necessarily from a blank slate. I would make the distinction about information that exists on the site in the organization versus information that sort of feeds like literature review or something like that, if you're working with a population. So I'm thinking of, who am I thinking of? John Creswell, right? Talks about this example of doing a study on pregnant women, for example, right? It's hard not to read up on all the information about pregnancy and prenatal care and all that kind of stuff. That's pre-existing information versus the organization perhaps that you've identified on how they approach pregnancy, right? Those are the distinctions that I would make. And it's the latter, if you want to be a classic grounded theorist, it's the latter, focusing on information that may exist for the organization as opposed to the literature or theoretical background.
Alex, since we're asking questions, yeah, I just wanted to ask, going back to the interviews, what about what role does member checking have in that process in terms of checking with the participant that you did the interview with? Just speak to that, or whether this should be a second, what you recommend with a second visit. So
yeah, great question. So one of the keys to good interviewing is never committing necessarily to the first answer, right? Never committing to just the first answer. Again, if it's your first interview, they want to be helpful. You ask a question, they answer it. You ask another question, they answer it. It's really about hermeneutics, right? Meaning making. So a common thing that I do is I say, can you give me an example of what you just said? That's a common follow-up probe question. The second one is, what do you mean by that? Now, things going on right now are really stressful. You're like, oh, okay, yeah. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by stressful? Can you give me an example of that? So even in your first round of questions, you're able to probe and ask. If you forgot to do that, or there's more detail that can emerge from that, you're looking at your transcripts and reading through it, trying to make sense of what the participant said. You can always then make a note of that, and in your follow-up, go back and say, you talked about this being stressful season for you or a stressful environment. What did you mean by that? That's a good form of member checking. So it's not what you say, it's what you mean. And that can happen at multiple levels.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. A lot of that is rooted in your own biases and assumptions that we think we know what they mean, right? And that's why it's always good to give a little bit of distance. Okay. Role of the researcher. Again, there's a huge section of this in every dissertation for qualitative that I think is important, but it's also important for a paper that you're submitting for a journal. 25-page paper, you're not going to get that much in, but you need just enough and what's germane to the topic at hand. If I'm addressing life as faculty and that's my study, I think it's important that I mention my own role as a faculty member and my experiences, right? The reader needs to know that. What makes it relevant in terms of my own story. And then my own ontology and epistemology may matter. My teaching philosophy vis-a-vis what I'm doing with my participants if I'm studying faculty and understanding their pedagogical assumptions. All right. Almost done here. Maureen asked the question about member checking, and this is tied to trustworthiness. Trustworthiness. Again, we embrace subjectivity. We recognize our own biases. What makes a study valid or trustworthy for qualitative research? Your ability to translate to the reader what you know and what you don't know, right? We don't work from the assumption that it's all-knowing, all-wise a researcher that's neutral in all these hot-button issues. We embrace our subjectivity. And the danger of tying up all of our findings in a nice little bow where there are no extraneous stories or somebody's meaning making doesn't align with the others, right? That doesn't make if you include that in your write-up, it doesn't make it less valid. Actually, it makes it more valid because it embraces the messiness of the human condition. I gave this example recently about the 2008 housing crisis, as we slowly seem to be falling into a potential another bubble. In the housing crisis, they said, well, how did people react when they lost their houses to the bank, right? Well, there was no one reaction. The common story that we hear is people were saying things like, they tore out the carpets, they took out the copper wiring because they knew it wasn't their house anymore. They took the kitchen sink literally as they were leaving their house. A lot of people did that. On the other side, there were people who vacuumed the carpet, washed and cleaned the house, cleaned the windows, and left a message saying, we loved this house. We're really hoping that the next people who come into it will be blessed by this house as well. Two very, very different reactions to the same situation. Is one more valid than the other? They absolutely contradict each other, but it's important to include both, right? Because it tells a story. It doesn't make it less valid or less trustworthy. It actually makes it more trustworthy in your reporting, right? And that's not talking about objectivity. It's just embracing both sides of the story. Another pro tip, avoid the temptation of saying things like 8 out of 9 participants said this, as if somehow that makes it more valid. Now that just reveals some of your closeted quantitative nature, and that's okay. It comes out once in a while. I'm going to try to help you. Saying that 8 out of 9 people did it, or the majority of people said this, and that's why I'm reporting it, doesn't make it more valid, right? Or we'll get into a little bit of this with coding. But if you say that this word was used the most often by everybody, right? That doesn't make something more valid. It just said that's a word they used a lot. You didn't do member checking, but everyone said it's stressful. But stressful how? Stressful when? Stressful in what ways, right? And it may be different for different people. So you want to be careful with that. And you can't just dump your transcripts into a coding machine and expect it to come out, because guess what's the most common word that emerges when you do repetition, based on just on repetition? The word the. And there's no significance in the word, right? It just came up a lot. So you get what I'm saying. I don't want to be overly cheeky with it, but that's important. Credibility, dependability, confirmability. These are all words that we use that we're looking for in your write-up. And there should be a section in every paper that talks about how you accounted for validity. Sometimes it's triangulation. I did interviews, multiple interviews is a form of triangulation. Multiple interviews with the same person, multiple interviews with different people, right? I did focus group interviews to counteract individual interviews. I did observations, the example I gave you about this student, right, in class, right? That's a form of triangulation. Multiple sources. And sometimes it's archival information and documents that you're also analyzing. Somebody recently was working with me and they were talking about what churches, pastors are saying about justice and what's written on their church website and on their different documents that they've published. Is it consistent with what's preached on Sundays and in different groups? How are the two aligned? Well, triangulation would reveal that. It's not something that they're saying and writing, but it's also something they're hearing and something that they're doing actively. And your observations of different events would reveal that. That's a form of triangulation. Okay. Other things to consider: strategies for trustworthiness, extensive time in the field, extensive time, the prolonged engagement, right? How much time did you spend? I gave an example earlier about ethnography, and ethnographers who are purists will say an ethnography should take a limited, at a minimum 3 years. First year and a half is language acquisition and culture, and you've embedded yourself. But if you say, oh, I did an ethnography and it took 6 months, 6 whole months, they're going to say that's not an ethnography, right? Extensive time. Now, not everyone's going to spend 6, 7 years in the field. I get that. But how do you document the rigor in terms of time in the field? That's important. Other parts of trustworthiness, I talked about negative case analysis, right? It's not an outlier. We don't throw it out. But 5 people said one thing and 1 person said the other. Is it less valid because only 1 person said it? Of course not. Does it throw a monkey wrench into what everyone else said? Yes. But we embrace that, embrace the messiness and be able to say these are things that this is telling the whole story, right? And it shouldn't be tied up in a neat little bow. Thick description, Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, talked about thick description. Using the words of the participants is important. Giving rich analysis of what's happening is important. Remember the reader. Getting feedback from others, it's participants, not just the people that you're working with. It's maybe you have a cultural guide or an external reader. This is what your dissertation committee is for. This is what a methodologist is for, but don't work in isolation. Maybe there's someone who can read not the transcripts, but your analysis in light of the transcripts. And there are things that someone else who's not an expert in the field is going to read this and say, oh, here's something that struck me, but you didn't say anything about it. Or here's something that struck me in an interview and you went with it, but that's not the direction I would have gone, right? You need that kind of healthy backstopping and pushback in order for you to reconsider your own assumptions and then go back to the participants and ask them. And that's participant confirmation. Okay, last slide. Is this my last slide? I think so. Almost last slide, sorry. Gaining a deeper holistic understanding of the problem is important, but it is labor intensive. It's a lengthy process. We're at the mercy of our own subjectivity of what we know when we know it. And there's no generalizability, but the good news is it's universally understood. So it's bigger than generalizability, right? These are universal concepts of the human condition oftentimes that we're addressing. And I think that's an important element that I will stop. All right. I'm going to catch my breath here as you all let this marinate for a bit, and happy to entertain some questions and comments that you might have.
I want to, are you opening up for questions?
Yes. Okay.
This is a conversation related to ones you and I had years ago, and I'm still a little bit bothered by it. And it's what you just kind of emphasized there. So So if, for example, if someone were to do a study on the effect of people losing their houses due to economic things, what effect that has on people's emotions, and you interview 10 people, 9 people say they were stressed by it. One person said they were liberated by that. It seems like you could draw a conclusion from that it would be stressful for most people, and that the qualitative researcher job would then be to find out what type of stress is involved with these 9 people. Not that you wouldn't conclude that somebody would equally be feel liberated or stressed if they lost their house, right? I guess I'm a physicist, so I'm having trouble here.
It's okay, I forgive you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, you just seem to, maybe you did it intentionally, maybe not, or maybe I'm misunderstanding, but you just seem to discount anything that's quantitative, an obvious quantitative kind of bent, that it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yes, Don, it's true. I think the tendency for us, because the dominance of a quantitative oriented world and the way we think of meaning and significance, and this whole idea, and I think most of us were trained this way academically, is to consider one story that doesn't align with the others as an outlier. And I'm saying run toward that. Run toward the quote unquote outliers, because that's where maybe the real story is. It's not a matter of saying most of the people said this, and that sort of aligns with the generalizability of large scale studies, right? And so fundamentally, epistemologically, we're running toward individual stories, and that's why it matters. Now, it's important for us to make sure on the front end, on the design, that we were purposeful in our sampling. That's the term that we use, purposeful sampling as opposed to random sampling, right? And quantitative scientists will embrace the idea of random sampling because it seems more scientific and therefore maybe more reliable. Qualitative folks go absolutely the other way, and we say there is no random sampling. It's very purposeful or intellectual in our sampling. So the more that we're able to narrow down a very, very specific group on the front end, then all the variances that we might find within that smaller population, the variances aren't going to outweigh the, we're not dismissing it, because, this is the example that one of my colleagues said, not all Black women think the same. Much to maybe many people's surprise, right? Not all Black women think the same. So even when you narrow down to just Black women in a study, the more that you're able to narrow down, the more that you can embrace the variance and the difference. Teresa, you had a question.
Yes, thank you, Alex. Thanks so much for providing this resource today. I really appreciate it. I was intrigued by Don's question, and so I'm wondering if, in thinking of principles of observation, interpretation, and application, so if I observed in my research that 8 out of 10 of my participants had a certain point of view, then rather than making, let's say, the quantitative generalizability error, I would go in a different direction and say, this is intriguing, and it becomes a hermeneutical question, or what are all the ways that I would explore this finding? And are there variables, complex variables that are contextual or have to do with some shared experience that they had that was influencing their responses? Is it something like that?
That's good, yeah. Thank you for that. That reminds me that sometimes at the core of qualitative research is descriptive and exploratory in nature, right? And so we're not drawing conclusions. And I think, Elijah, that was a great comment that you made, that it's not necessarily trying to draw a conclusion, a definitive sort of answer to what it is. It's exploration and description of how people are experiencing a situation, right?
Mhm.
So in that sense, we're embracing the idea that there is not one answer, but multiple experiences and meaning making from an event.
Mhm.
Dr. Chung, you had a question. And then,
I think Tammy was first. Do you want to
oh,
go
I'm
first,
sorry,
Tammy?
Tammy, yeah, go ahead. No, okay.
Oh, so thank you so much, Alex. I'm a historian by training, so this is pretty new to me, and I have two questions. So currently I'm working on a book project, and most of it is going to be archival research. But on my final chapter, I want to include some of this qualitative method. But I'm conflicted because I want to do a really good job on it, but I'm going to have very limited time. So I guess my first question is, what is considered a credible sample size in a social scientific research? If I can't do it well, I might as well not do it in my final chapter. That is my first question. And second question is, what is a proper etiquette when you want to thank the participants?
Great questions. Looking forward to the book project. So this kind of ties into mixed methods. Sorry, I had one more slide I forgot to share. I'll do it in a bit. But it ties into this idea of mixed methods. And when we add on qualitative at the end, usually is what happens, right? Yours is not a mixed method, a historical approach, but with interviews, and that's fine. We want to be careful that it's not just checking the box. I also talked to some people, right, to confirm what I found. And so giving proper, I guess, respect to the field of qualitative research, recognizing everything that I just said is this whole other methodological world with its own standards of rigor. On that note, how many and how often is a big question for every doctoral student that I have, right? What's the number? And no one likes the answer, because the answer is, it depends. Actually, you should tell the reader what you have considered to be a rigorous sample, right? Going back to that approach of the universe of how many possible people I can interview, given my topic, how did I winnow this down to a certain number, right? Do I want to study all the Korean American men in the world, or can I narrow it down to just the good-looking one? So it's Alex and like 2 other people, right? You know, how do I narrow this study down? Thank you for laughing. It's important, but if you say, oh, I just found the 3 people, so it's not random sampling, right? Because it's purposeful and intellectual sampling. How did you go about that process? And is it enough to say I interviewed them once? Does that make it rigorous? 2, 3, 4 times? Certainly makes it more rigorous than just once, but I interviewed them 67 times? Probably too much. So somewhere in between is the right answer. But you possess the answer to that question, and you stand by it. And this is what I share with people who, you know, at dissertation phase, I'm like, it is literally an oral defense of your work. And, you know, one of the questions they ask as a methodologist is, how many interviews did you do? And was that enough? And was it rigorous, right? And I'm not trying to trip you up. I want to give you the opportunity to own it and defend what you did and why you did it, right? And if you can stand by it and saying, knowing what I know, this is rigorous for me. People could, your reader can disagree, but at least you explained what you did and how you did it. Was there a second question, or did I answer both?
Yeah, just the proper etiquette for
Yeah.
expressing things for the participants.
Yeah, I'm glad Dawn's on the call. There's no, from IRB's perspective, right? You don't want to overly incentivize, and you also don't want to bully. What's the word? It's not bullying, but overly. I'm blanking on the word. Anyone? Anyway, you don't want to force people into a study, but we're talking about the incentive side of it. And you know, if you said everyone, coerce. Thank you. You don't want to coerce. And part of that is naturally your position of power, right? That's why faculty can't interview their students. But if you said $5 Starbucks gift certificate for everybody who participates, that's not unnecessarily, incentivizing that someone won't participate in the study, but wow, for $5, I'll do it, right? That's not, but if you said everyone gets $100, I wouldn't have done the study, but for $100, I'll do anything, right? That's overly incentivizing. I think those are the distinctions. Where I fall is you can do a $5 gift certificate. I don't think you need to tell the participants that they're getting a $5 gift certificate for their participation. You might need to tell IRB that that's what you're going to do, but it's, you can say, hey, by the way, thanks for your participation. Here's a link. So I think that's just a way of saying thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, they're usually actually told going in. Most of the IRB applications, the script that they give to the prospective participants usually do identify, what they will receive as a result of that.
I'm pretty sure from IRB's side, the most important thing is that it's not overly incentivized.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's the main point.
Yeah. Thanks, Vijin. Tammy, thanks for waiting so patiently.
Sure, no problem. So my area of interest or study normally is around disability, and particularly folks with developmental disabilities. And there's a lot of conversation about them not being represented in research. And part of that, I've proposed studies before and kind of been warned because that's more difficult related to IRB because they're a vulnerable population. Right. What is your advice to kind of address, like have their voice be heard, but being able to appropriately access an IRB with that population?
Ooh. That is a really, really good question. One of my students just defended her dissertation on students who are college-age students with AS, various stages of AS, and fascinating study because the question was about agency, and you're spot on. One, we didn't work when they were minors. We didn't do the study because there's a whole other layer of assent that's required, right? Not individual consent, but they were over 18. We were able to get through IRB primarily because they were college-age students, and they were able, and sort of the scope of what they were dealing with in terms of AS, they were able to make their own decisions. And so, but we did also ask parents. That's a challenge. The other part in this particular study, it was not all interviews in person, right? We said, we're going to take various forms. So sometimes it's in writing because people communicated differently in this particular study. Participants would rather speak into a voice to text or, write their answers as opposed to meeting in person and having a social engagement in that sense. And so in IRB, I think that's how we wrote it up. Multiple forms of communication was part of the process. But that's a very specific question, I think, from IRB's perspective of who would be eligible. We know this can't work with pregnant women or people who are incarcerated, children under 18, minors, right? Those are the three that come to mind, but certainly participants with potential developmental challenges may fall into this category as well. So being clear how we address that, making sure that if they're over 18, that at least gives you one way. Dawn, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, just being a vulnerable population is just that, it's vulnerable. So there's some scrutiny there, but that doesn't mean you're not eligible to work with them. So just keep that in mind. And by the way, pregnant women are no longer considered in the vulnerable population.
Interesting.
Yeah, that changed 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you. Because the most of the folks that I'm thinking of are over 18 and they're not conserved. So they have all the legal rights to make a decision. So as long as that's the case, it almost seems discriminatory to say, well, I can't interview you because you're a vulnerable population, where they wouldn't consider themselves that way. You know, they make themselves able to speak for themselves, and that's the point of the research, you know, is to get their voice out.
But once again, it's not that I can't interview you because you're vulnerable. It's I can interview you, but the IRB will probably require like a full board review and a little bit more scrutiny as to how that process goes. Not that you can or can't.
Yeah. But Tammy, you just made a really good argument for rationale to say, if when you submit this to IRB, to say, this is the population that I'm considering, right? And they're adults and they're not under care for someone else. So, you know, this reveals agency on their part. So yeah, that's a really good point. Those are the types of things that I would imagine. I'm not on IRB, but I've dealt with it enough to know that those are the types of things that you need to make clear in your proposal. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Teresa.
Thank you, Alex. So I am conducting a mixed method study of psychoanalysts across the country who are engaged in social justice endeavors in the interest of diversity and equity and inclusion. And so it involves archival data, which we have drawn that down and created a database. It's being updated now. And then the next phase was a quantitative survey that's been sent out, and we'll be collecting that data through Qualtrics. And then the third phase is qualitative interviews. And the interviews are going to be narrative in the sense that I'm not, what I'm wanting to do is tell the stories in a rich and thick way about analysts who are engaged in very creative endeavors. For example, there's a center in New York that works with immigration lawyers and asylum lawyers and conducts all the interviews of families who are seeking asylum and refugee status. And so it's a partnership between the psychoanalysts at NYU and the immigration lawyers in the city of New York. So that's one example. And each of these endeavors are very unique to the person, to the context. And so what I'm wanting to do, because it's a national study, is to try to have representation geographically, also gender, culturally, ethnically, and also the type of service. For example, there's analysts working at the border with family reunification. There are analysts working in Philadelphia in the inner city, providing services, pro bono services to homeless people. That's their whole focus. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts about the design of that, because it seems it's more of a narrative of each person versus something I'm trying to codify in the sense to see if there's similarities or differences between the participants.
That's great. Sounds like a very, very comprehensive study, and that's good. Mixed methods, it's really hard to do by yourself, right? So at this stage, colleagues, it's nice to work with friends and someone who's quantitatively oriented, have that person handle the quantitative piece, and then qualitative folks handle the qualitative piece. So I'm a big proponent of collaboration in terms of research. And so focusing on just the qualitative piece, I think is important, Teresa, as you're focusing on that. Because if we don't do that, we fall into the danger of not mixed methods, but mixed up methods, right? We're actually doing the same thing qualitatively, asking the same questions and making it similar to the quantitative approach, right? Because we're unable to make the distinctions between one and the other. So I love the way that you framed it. Someone's doing the quantitative, it's going to be a large scale, what have you. And then focusing on the individual stories of the participants, right? And that's the beauty of research and the multiple realms that we live in terms of methods. Qualitative will absolutely bring out the individual stories. You're not doing a compare and contrast. You really want to know the life stories of people who are doing this work.
Yes, that's right.
And that
Yes.
may not be tied to the quantitative stuff. It doesn't have to be.
That's right. Yes, yes. I'm very yes, I'm very aware of that. And so each is a sort of data set unto itself, and I'm not necessarily looking for connections across all three. I mean, it'll each
Perfect.
be analyzed in the context that it was conducted. So I'm interested in your thoughts, or if you have any resources to point me in the direction of designing and conducting these kinds of narrative interviews where, just as you said, I want the story of the person who founded each of these endeavors, and how, you know, all the sources that influence them to create such an innovative service.
Great. Yeah. The go-to person in social science research is Jean Clendenin. Yeah. And she does a lot of work on narrative inquiry. And so, you know, I like to say read backwards, you know, start with narrative inquiry. When you read backwards, you'll see the same names of authors who are being cited time and time again. That's a good indicator in terms of lit review of method of who the main people are. And just on what you were saying, I think it's again an important distinction between phenomenological research, hermeneutic phenomenology, which is a shared experience, versus narrative inquiry,
Yes.
or life history stories, which is the totality of a person's story, right?
Right. Yes.
And
yes,
so
I looked at that comparison, and it seemed narrative was most suited to what I was wanting to do. Would you say so? Because I looked at some information about phenomenological research, and so there's some shared experience in that all my participants will be psychoanalysts, but there's very individual experience in terms of geography, type of services, ethnicity, culture.
yeah, I think the key, remember the reader. The reader knows nothing. So if you don't explain how you landed on narrative inquiry as opposed to hermeneutic phenomenology, right, the reader won't know. So if the opposite, here's an argument that I could make, given what I know, these are all psychoanalysts who started a practice, and they share that same thing because they're all founders of an organization.
Entrepreneurs, in a sense.
Yeah, of psychoanalysis. So in that sense, it's a shared experience, regardless of geography or time.
That's right.
Someone's doing it for 30 years, someone doing it for 3, but they have the same shared experience. That's rationale for me to say I'm doing a hermeneutic phenomenological approach. Reader can disagree, but at least I gave my rationale as to why. And friends, that's the take-home message here, is to say you get to determine and make your case, right? To the jury. You get to make your case as you make your argument to say, here's why I'm doing what I'm doing and where I landed. You can agree, you can disagree, but at least you know where I came from. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, thank you. That's so helpful.
All right. We're working our way through questions.
Would you comment on software? APU we now have an institutional kind of license for deduce. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about that.
All right. One more slide here, friends. We talked a little bit about IRB, informed consent. It's important. Let me get to this one first. You're welcome, Don. IRB is very important. Yes. If you're going to conduct a study that you want to publish, that's the key. If you want to publish this someday, then you have to have IRB. That's the order of things. If you just want to interview people and start having informal conversations, you don't need IRB for that. You just talk to people. That's fine. But be very careful that if that conversation somehow turns into something that you want to publish later, that's a no-no. That's the ethical violation. Okay, Deduce is now finally, thank the good Lord, free and available for all faculty members. I do a lot of stuff on dominance and supremacy, and I always said methodological dominance and supremacy at APU has always been quantitative. I remember when the poor IT person came to my office and uploaded, took up a bunch of space on like SPSS. And I'm like, trust me, I don't need the SPSS on my computer. And they're like, but you're a faculty member, you do research. I'm like, yeah, I do qualitative. They're like, well, take it anyway, because everybody gets it and it's free. We finally have Deduce. All you need to do is go, Don, you may have the link, right? For putting Deduce on your computer, and it's an APU address is what we need, and then it goes through a different system, and then it's free for us. I mentioned some of the things about coding. It's helpful, but it's not, doesn't solve all your problems. It just helps you organize your thinking. And I think Deduce has some really good how-to videos, but pretty straightforward. You can practice on your own, on coding software, on how to code, but it doesn't solve all your problems. It doesn't do the work for you in the sense that you're still looking for meaning and working with member checking. The software doesn't necessarily do that for you. I talked about mixed methods, and I want to go back to an earlier point about mixed methods. And if you're focusing just on the qualitative piece, know the limitations. Not only do we stay in our lanes, it's qualitative and not trying to do all the other pieces that are national data sets through a qualitative way, through interviews. That's never going to happen. But baby steps. It's one study that focuses on, I don't know, 10 to 12 individuals whom you've purposefully identified in your intellectual sampling. That's one round. And then you can do another study, right? So being able to recognize that you're not going to do this comprehensive qualitative methodological approach. That's the inherent limitation with qualitative. It's time intensive, labor intensive, and limited in our ability to generalize in scope. Don, did you want me to say more about Deduce and the software, other than that we're grateful for all your work and making it available to all?
Yeah, I think the key people were Stacy Kula and Candy Mink Salas out of the DSC to make that available. Just want to make sure everybody knew it was available. And if just send me an email and I'll send you the connection. I don't use Deduce, but I could send you the information if for some reason you haven't picked it up from the Provost newsletter yet.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted you to comment on the what you perceive to be the value of Deduce or software in terms of qualitative research. So do you personally use it, Alex?
I do, and my research team uses it. This is like maybe my 5th version of different qualitative software, and Deduce has been my favorite.
Okay.
Partially because you don't have to download anything, but now they've changed it so you have to have a desktop version of it. So you didn't have to buy like the software for $1,000. It's now monthly for me, $9.95. I have all my research team use it as well. Yeah, and Vivo was the earlier version that everybody used, but Deduce made it so much clearer, more user-friendly, I want to say.
Yeah, and Deduce was cloud-based instead of, like you say, whereas in Vivo you had to download the all the stuff onto your local computer. Yeah.
So the beauty is with my research team, everybody's on it now. I don't have to pay for it anymore. All my research students are all on it, I'm saying, so they have access to it. So when they're doing their dissertations, right, you could just go into the document. It's a shared file online. You don't need to send anything. I remember having to learn FTP to send stuff from NVivo. I mean, I'm getting triggered just thinking about it. Horrible experience, but yeah, cloud-based. And so it's really, really helpful. By the way, several questions about, are my slides going to be available? Absolutely. I'll put it in a PDF, and I'm happy to share it here, or I can send it to Don, who can send it out to people who participated. We'll do it that way.
Okay.
But yeah, my slides are available for anyone. Absolutely. I hope you find it helpful. My last point was on publication that I thought, take us in a slightly different direction. You want to make sure that all this work that you do ends up going somewhere and getting it published. Make sure that you identify journals that are friendly to qualitative methods. It doesn't have to be a qualitative methods journal. There are several out there, but most of the qualitative methods journal focus on qualitative methods rather than content and findings. But all you need to do is skim through online and look at several articles that have been published in the last year of that particular journal. That'll tell you a lot about what the editorial board values and doesn't value, not just content, but methodology. Otherwise, you're wasting your time, even if it's the most prominent journal in your field. If they're not going to read qualitative work, it ain't going to help you. So save yourself some trouble on the front end, or a quick email to the editorial manager and say, I didn't notice any qualitative methods in your thing. Do you have one? I think that's important. To the extent possible, journal is going to be 25 pages. Be very, very thick in your description in the write-up section. That's going to be important. There's always going to be a section on your findings. Don't go short shrift on that, because that's the beauty of a qualitative method, that you get to retell the stories. And that's why it's important for journals that you identify who don't see that as non-academic, but see it as very much part of the academic endeavor of being able to retell stories in the findings section. So that's my little word on publications, and so saving yourself time and anguish from identifying just because everyone's submitting to a journal in your field, in your discipline, but they're not doing qualitative. That's not going to help you. That you get published is more important than where you get published, I think. Now, you don't want to necessarily publish in My Scholarly Journal or self-publish, but aside from that, I think any sort of peer-reviewed journal is going to be important. Now, work it out with your individual department chair, but for the most part, I'm grateful about the way APU has worked for me, that we publish. One of my most significant articles that I published with my research team came out in an online journal on something on pedagogy, and it's locally in Pacific Northwest, on anti-racism in higher education. The most downloaded of anything I've ever written. And it was an online journal. So who do you want to make an impact for? And who do you want reading it is more important than, oh, it has a rejection rate of 99% and I got it published, right? Yeah. Don't matter. We want to get it in the hands of people who are actually going to read it and do something. So sorry, getting off my soapbox now, but that was my 2 cents on publications, where we publish and why. The other thing is, some of you recently maybe finished your dissertation, and what can you do with that work? What naturally emerges is hopefully you've given yourself good instructions on new directions that you can take for your own research. So your dissertation there may be sections that you can publish immediately right out of your dissertation. Condensing 300 pages into 30 is not an easy task, but talk to your dissertation chair. Give that person the right of first right of refusal to say, yeah, I want to publish with you. It's good common courtesy and practice to ask your dissertation chair if that person wants to work with you. They will usually take a hatchet to your work and say, I can take 300 pages and cut it down to 30 if you cannot. The other thing to keep in mind, this is something that I've been practicing, working in threes, always working in threes. And what I mean by that is, at any given time, there's a project that I'm finishing in terms of writing, because it's a revise and resubmit, and I've got to finish the editorial piece. There's a project that I'm currently involved in, and I'm writing and doing research on. And then there's a project that emerges. It's sort of the inception point that I'm coming up with a new idea of what I want to do next. Always working in thirds in that sense, right? 3 projects. That keeps us moving in terms of projects. One that I'm finishing, one that I'm currently in, and one I'm about to start. That's about the max of what I can handle in terms of the project mill.
That also keeps your productivity going in case you hit a roadblock in one project. You're not just stopped. You've got 2 others to be working with.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that usually keeps you going. And again, staying in your lane, knowing that you're not biting off more than you can chew. It's not a 300 person project, right? 300 participants. It might be 10 participants, but here's the first 10, and then the next 10, and then the next 10. And I can focus geographically, I can focus on gender, I can focus on race. The limitations on a qualitative study write themselves. But what it does for us, it gives us direction for our next project, right? So we're not comparing apples and oranges. Do apples first, right? Do Granny Smith apples first, and then do Macintosh, and then move on to oranges and say, I'm going to do navel, and then I'm going to, so there are many different ways that you can do it, but that gives us plenty of work to do in reasonable bite-sized increments. That's worked for me in the last 15, 20 years. And so this is advice that I thought I'd share with you all in terms of not even the nuts and bolts of methods, just mentality and how we want to approach this. We have about 7, 8 minutes left. So any additional questions that you have? Otherwise, happy to give the time back to you.
There was a question, how similar is deduce to in vivo? Did you address that?
Yeah, they're similar, but deduce is easier, much more user-friendly, straightforward language, and then drag and drop. Maybe in vivo has changed over the years because of that, but I just love the look and feel of deduce. You literally could just highlight stuff. It's intuitive. Yeah. And I'm not paid by deduce. In fact, I've given them plenty of research money. Okay, let's see. What is there a question here about comparative case study? Oh, good. Congratulations. That's great. Okay, do we need, sorry, Elijah, do you need your, yeah.
Does if you're doing your own kind of coding and you want someone to come on and do inter-rater reliability on the coding, do they need their own account, or can you set up like a sub account within your own account? Or
for deduce, for deduce, you could give it to them, but I think it's more important that if you share what I've done as an external, right? Even as a methodologist, I don't go into the weeds of a deduce with my students, primarily because I tell them, you're the instrument, you're the researcher. Now, what's my role then as a guide? I'm trying to backstop your interpretive lens, not trying to find the answer, right? This is an important distinction, I think. I'm not trying to find the right answer because there is no right answer. There are multiple versions of truth.
You're talking to a chemist there.
I know, Don. I was looking at you. I know you wouldn't stay silent.
You know I'm getting nervous.
I know it. I'm going to say it again just because. There is no one truth in social science research and qualitative research. So if that's the case, my job, or an external inter-rater, their job is to help you understand your interpretive lens of truth. Because at the end of the day, I can't convince you to see something that you can't see. We can argue and debate. The only thing I'd say at the end of that argument is to say, please at least include that you talk to somebody who disagreed with my analysis in my final analysis, and this is what I stand by. That's for the sake of the reader to say, ah, I see, you just don't see it, but at least you get that you don't see it. I'll give you an example of this. I love this book. I still use it. It came out like a dozen years ago, but Peter McGolda and his colleague, Eben Gross, neither of them are Christians, but they did a book on, basically it was like InterVarsity Campus Crusade for Christ. It's all about Jesus. And they did this book in my University of Miami in Ohio, looking at a campus ministry, IV or CCC or whatever it is. And they were ethnographers, and they were fascinated by the ritualistic practices of this religious organization and everything that they did. Great write-up, thick description. They're not Christians. They fundamentally don't understand the work of, they're talking about this religious practice and experience that people then trance-like movements and hands started to go up. I'm like, oh, you're talking about devotions. You're talking about worship, right? Wednesday night worship. You get close to it, but you fundamentally don't get it. I loved what they did, because at the end of this 1.5 year long project with Christians, and they're like, yeah, they kept trying to proselytize to us and all this stuff. At the end of it, they gave final say to the participants, and the students were able to say, these are the things, we read your work and your interpretation of what you think we are. Here's what you don't get. Here's what you don't understand. And they took the time to include that, right? Did it make their findings better or worse? I think it made it better, 100 times better, because they were able to recognize what they don't know. But good enough to say, we don't know what we don't know. These are what participants are saying about the work that we did. Excellent observational data, all this kind of stuff. Just fundamentally, they don't understand the endeavor of Christianity and the religious practices of what they do. I thought that was a great example. So I think that's ultimately where you want to end up. There is no truth in that sense. They missed it, right? But they were able to at least mitigate some misunderstandings and recognize that they don't know what they don't know. Read that book, by the way, and tell me what you think. If you have, it's a summer, you have time. We have all the time in the world now.
What was the name of the book again?
It's all about Jesus. Yeah, the late Peter Magolda and Eben Gross. It's a real place. Over the years, I found out there are people who work there and they're like, oh yeah, I am familiar with that organization. I found out people who were in it at the time and they said, oh my God, yeah, I can't believe the guy wrote a book about this stuff. That was us. So fascinating book. I still use it for my PhD students in the methods class. All right, that's my time. Thank you all very much. I'll be back in the fall and available, Lord willing, and funding, if funding is available, I'll continue doing this work. What a blessing to be with you all. Thank you. Have a wonderful summer.
You too.